The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle as King Charles III walked slowly through the rose garden that had once been his mother's pride. His footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestone path, each step weighted with the burden of decisions that would soon shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. The year had been particularly challenging for the 75-year-old monarch, who had ascended to the throne with hopes of modernizing the institution while preserving its dignity and tradition. Charles paused beside a particularly beautiful white rose bush, its blooms reaching toward the pale autumn sun. The irony was not lost on him that he stood among symbols of purity and new beginnings while contemplating actions that would forever alter his personal relationships and potentially damage the reputation he had worked decades to rebuild. His weathered hands, marked by age spots and the constant reminder of time's passage, trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve a letter that had arrived 3 days earlier. The correspondence bore the official seal of his private investigative team, a group of discreet professionals he had reluctantly employed 6 months prior when whispers and rumors had grown too loud to ignore. The contents of the letter had confirmed his worst fears about certain members of Camilla's extended family and their increasingly problematic behavior. What had begun as minor embarrassments had escalated into situations that threatened the dignity of the crown itself. As he unfolded the crisp white paper for what felt like the 100th time, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. His marriage to Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, had been one of redemption and genuine love, a relationship that had weathered decades of public scrutiny and personal sacrifice. The British people had slowly warmed to their queen consort, appreciating her down-to-earth nature and dedication to charitable causes. However, the same could not be said for all members of her family circle. The investigation had revealed a web of questionable financial dealings, inappropriate social media posts, and associations with individuals whose reputations were far from suitable for connection to the royal family. Camilla's younger brother, Mark Shand, had passed away years earlier, but other relatives had proven to be sources of continuous concern. Her son Tom Parker Bowles had generally maintained a respectable profile, but extended family members had not shown the same discretion. Charles remembered the conversation he had held with his private secretary just 48 hours earlier. Sir Clive Alderton had approached the topic with his characteristic diplomacy, but the message had been clear. Action needed to be taken before the situation spiraled beyond control. The monarchy's reputation, already fragile in an era of increasing Republican sentiment, could not withstand another major scandal. The king's mind wandered to his beloved wife, currently attending a charity luncheon in London, unaware of the storm that was about to engulf her family. Camilla had always been fiercely protective of her relatives, often making excuses for their behavior and attempting to shield them from public criticism. Her loyalty was admirable, but had become a liability that Charles could no longer afford to overlook. Standing in the garden where he had proposed to Diana decades earlier, Charles felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Every decision he made as monarch would be scrutinized, analyzed, and recorded for posterity. The choice before him was not just about family relationships. It was about the future of the institution he had inherited and his duty to preserve it for future generations. The morning sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows across the manicured lawn. Charles knew that within hours, he would need to make the most difficult decision of his reign. The thought of severing ties with Camilla's family filled him with dread, not because of the public relations nightmare it would create, but because of the personal pain it would cause his wife. Their marriage had been built on understanding, compromise, and mutual respect. This decision would test all of those foundations. As he walked back toward the castle, Charles passed the memorial garden dedicated to his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The sight of her favorite flowers, carefully maintained by the royal gardeners, reminded him of her unwavering commitment to duty above all else. She had made countless personal sacrifices for the crown, including setting aside her own feelings when circumstances demanded it. Now, Charles found himself facing a similar crossroads. The ornate doors of Windsor Castle loomed before him, their ancient wood bearing witness to centuries of royal decisions, both triumphant and tragic. Inside those walls, generations of monarchs had grappled with choices that would define their legacies. Charles understood that his handling of this family crisis would become part of that historical narrative, a chapter that future biographers would analyze and debate. His personal protection officers had noticed his increasingly somber mood over the past week, though their training prevented them from inquiring about matters that were clearly weighing heavily on the king's mind. Charles had always been a contemplative man, prone to periods of deep reflection, but this situation had pushed him into uncharted emotional territory. The castle's corridors, filled with portraits of his ancestors, seemed to whisper reminders of the sacrifices required by the crown. King George VI had never wanted to be king but had risen to the occasion when duty called. King Edward VIII had chosen love over duty and lived with the consequences for the rest of his life. Charles now faced his own defining moment, one that would require him to balance personal loyalty with institutional responsibility. As he approached his private study, Charles could see his staff moving with their usual efficiency, unaware that their king was about to make a decision that would send shockwaves through the royal family and beyond. The red boxes containing state papers waited on his desk, but today they would have to wait. More pressing matters demanded his immediate attention. The telephone on his mahogany desk would soon carry conversations that would change everything. Lawyers would need to be consulted, statements prepared, and security arrangements reviewed. The machinery of modern monarchy would swing into action to manage yet another crisis. But this time the crisis struck at the very heart of the royal marriage. Charles sat heavily in his leather chair, the same one his mother had used during her visits to Windsor. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had never felt heavier than it did at this moment. Outside his window, the grounds of Windsor Castle stretched toward the horizon, a reminder of the vast responsibilities that came with his position and the countless people who depended on the stability and dignity of the institution he represented. The decision could not be delayed any longer. The evidence was overwhelming, the risks too great, and the duty too clear. King Charles III would have to sever ties with Camilla's family, regardless of the personal cost. The only question now was how to minimize the damage to his marriage and the monarchy itself. As he reached for his private telephone, Charles whispered a silent prayer for wisdom and strength, knowing that the conversation he was about to initiate would mark the beginning of the most challenging period of his reign. The call came at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just as Camilla was finishing her third engagement of the day at a children's hospital in South London. Her private secretary, Sophie Densham, noticed the immediate change in the Queen Consort's demeanor when she answered her secure mobile phone. The warm smile that had graced her face throughout the hospital visit faded quickly, replaced by a look of confusion and growing alarm. Charles's voice on the other end of the line was measured but firm, each word carefully chosen to convey the gravity of the situation while attempting to spare his wife unnecessary shock. He had rehearsed this conversation multiple times in his study, but nothing had prepared him for the actual moment of delivering news that would devastate the woman he loved. The background noise of the hospital corridor seemed to fade as Camilla processed the implications of what her husband was telling her. The investigation's findings were presented with clinical precision, though Charles softened the delivery as much as possible. Financial irregularities involving her nephew's business dealings, inappropriate behavior at public events, and concerning associations with individuals of questionable reputation had created a situation that threatened the monarchy's reputation. Most damaging were recent photographs that had surfaced showing extended family members in compromising situations, images that tabloid newspapers were reportedly preparing to publish. Camilla's immediate response was one of fierce defense, her maternal instincts overriding any consideration of royal protocol. She argued passionately for her family's character, citing their loyalty and support throughout the most difficult periods of her public life. Her voice rose slightly, drawing concerned glances from hospital staff who maintained a respectful distance while ensuring the Queen Consort's privacy and security. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Charles patiently explaining the legal advice he had received and the unanimous recommendation from his senior advisors. The Attorney General had been consulted, and the consensus was clear: immediate action was necessary to protect the Crown's reputation. The alternative, allowing the situation to continue unchecked, posed unacceptable risks to the monarchy's standing with the British public and the Commonwealth realms. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Camilla's initial anger gave way to a profound sense of betrayal, not by her family, but by the investigation itself. She had not been informed of the inquiry, a decision Charles had made to protect her from unnecessary worry and to ensure the investigation's objectivity. This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. as Camilla struggled to understand how such a momentous decision could be made without her knowledge or input. The journey back to Windsor Castle in the royal car was conducted in relative silence, with Camilla staring out the window at the London landscape passing by. Her protection officers maintained their professional vigilance while respecting her obvious need for privacy and contemplation. The usual friendly exchanges with her security team were absent, replaced by a heavy atmosphere of unspoken tension. Upon arriving at Windsor, Camilla went directly to her private apartments, declining the traditional afternoon tea that had become a cherished ritual in her daily routine. Her lady-in-waiting, recognizing the signs of emotional distress, quietly canceled the evening's engagements and ensured that the queen consort would have the space and time needed to process this unexpected development. The confrontation between husband and wife took place in the private sitting room they had shared for countless intimate conversations throughout their marriage. The room, decorated with personal photographs and mementos from their travels together, seemed to mock the tension that now filled the space. Charles had hoped that the familiar surroundings might soften the blow, but the opposite proved true as the contrast between their normal domestic happiness and the current crisis became even more stark. Camilla demanded to see all the evidence, every photograph, document, and witness statement that had led to this dramatic decision. Charles had anticipated this request and had prepared a comprehensive file, though he dreaded the moment when his wife would see the full extent of her family's questionable activities. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, painting a picture of behavior that was incompatible with royal standards and expectations. As Camilla reviewed the materials, her expression shifted from skepticism to shock, and, finally, to a heartbreaking acceptance of the situation's severity. Some of the evidence involved family members she had considered beyond reproach, individuals she had defended and supported throughout their adult lives. The realization that her trust had been misplaced was perhaps more painful than the king's decision to sever ties. The discussion that followed was one of the most challenging of their marriage, touching on fundamental questions of loyalty, duty, and the sacrifices required by their unique position. Camilla argued that family bonds should transcend royal obligations, while Charles maintained that his duty to the crown and the British people must take precedence over personal relationships. Both perspectives had merit, making the resolution even more complex and emotionally charged. Charles explained the practical implications of the decision, including the immediate cessation of all financial support to extended family members, the revocation of royal patronages and associations, and the implementation of strict protocols preventing future contact during official events. The comprehensive nature of the separation was designed to send a clear message that the royal family would not tolerate behavior that brought the institution into disrepute. The emotional toll on Camilla became increasingly evident as the conversation progressed. Her hands shook slightly as she set down the evidence files, and her usual composed demeanor gave way to visible signs of distress. Charles reached out to comfort her, but she pulled away, needing space to process the magnitude of the situation and its implications for relationships she had cherished for decades. The practical arrangements required immediate attention despite the emotional turmoil. Legal documents needed to be prepared, security protocols reviewed, and communication strategies developed to manage the inevitable media attention. Charles's private secretary had already begun coordinating with various departments to ensure a smooth implementation of the new policies, though the human cost of these administrative actions weighed heavily on everyone involved. As evening approached, neither Charles nor Camilla had any appetite for dinner, despite the elaborate meal that had been prepared by the royal chefs. The domestic staff, sensing the unusual tension, went about their duties with extra discretion, understanding that their employers were navigating one of the most difficult periods of their marriage. The couple's usual evening routine of reading together in the library was abandoned in favor of separate contemplation. Charles remained in his study, reviewing the legal implications of his decision and preparing for the challenging conversations that would need to take place with various government officials and royal household staff. Camilla retreated to her private sitting room, where she attempted to process the day's revelations while grappling with the realization that her family relationships would never be the same. The weight of their respective positions had never been more apparent than it was that evening. Charles bore the responsibility of making decisions that protected the monarchy's future, even when those decisions caused personal pain. Camilla faced the devastating reality that her marriage to the king meant accepting sacrifices that went far beyond the ordinary compromises required in any relationship. As night fell over Windsor Castle, both husband and wife struggled with insomnia, each lost in their own thoughts about the irreversible changes that had begun that afternoon. The ancient walls of the castle had witnessed many royal crises throughout the centuries, but few had struck so directly at the heart of a royal marriage or forced such a stark choice between personal loyalty and institutional duty. The morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over Windsor Castle like a heavy fog. Charles had spent most of the night in his study, drafting and redrafting the formal statements that would need to be released to explain the royal family's decision. Each word was carefully considered, as he knew that every phrase would be dissected by constitutional experts, royal commentators, and the British public. The challenge lay in communicating the necessity of the action while maintaining some dignity for all parties involved. Camilla had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, her dreams plagued by memories of family gatherings and happier times when royal protocol seemed less important than family bonds. She awoke with a sense of profound loss, not just for the relationships that would be severed, but for the innocence she had maintained about her family's activities. The evidence she had reviewed the previous evening had shattered many of her long-held beliefs about the people she loved most. The first official meeting of the day took place at 8 o'clock sharp in the king's private office, attended by the private secretary, the queen consort's private secretary, the press secretary, and the chief of staff. The atmosphere was professional but subdued, as everyone present understood the gravity of the situation and its potential ramifications for the monarchy. Charts and timelines had been prepared, outlining the various steps that would need to be taken and the expected public reaction to each phase of the announcement. Charles opened the meeting by reaffirming his decision, despite the personal cost, and emphasizing that the action was being taken to protect the long-term interests of the crown. He acknowledged the pain it would cause his wife, but stressed that allowing the situation to continue would pose even greater risks to the monarchy's reputation and stability. The unanimous support of his advisors provided some comfort, though it did little to ease the emotional burden of the decision. The media strategy was particularly complex, as the royal family needed to control the narrative while avoiding any appearance of vindictiveness toward Camilla's relatives. The press release would focus on the need for all individuals associated with the royal family to maintain the highest standards of conduct, without providing specific details that might further damage reputations or violate privacy. The legal team had advised that revealing too much information could expose the crown to defamation claims, despite the accuracy of the evidence. Camilla's participation in the meeting was limited but crucial, as her input would be needed to ensure that the family members affected were notified before the public announcement. She insisted on personally calling the relatives who would be most impacted, despite the painful nature of these conversations. Her decision to take this responsibility reflected both her loyalty to her family and her commitment to handling the situation with as much grace as possible under difficult circumstances. The first of these calls was to her son Tom, who had always maintained a respectful distance from royal life while supporting his mother's role. His reaction was one of understanding mixed with disappointment, as he had long worried about the behavior of some extended family members. Tom assured his mother of his continued support and promised to help manage the family's response to minimize additional damage to the monarchy's reputation. The conversation with other family members proved more challenging, as many were genuinely surprised by the severity of the allegations and the definitive nature of the royal family's response. Some attempted to negotiate or promise improved behavior, not understanding that the decision was irreversible and had been made after careful consideration of all available options. The emotional difficulty of these calls took a visible toll on Camilla, who emerged from each conversation looking increasingly strained and exhausted. Meanwhile, Charles was dealing with the constitutional implications of his decision, consulting with the Prime Minister's office and senior government officials. The political ramifications were significant, as the action could be interpreted as the monarchy taking a more active stance in policing the behavior of individuals connected to the royal family. This raised questions about the boundaries between personal relationships and official duties, issues that would require careful navigation in the coming weeks. The legal complexities were equally challenging, as severing ties with family members involved more than simply issuing a public statement. Financial arrangements needed to be reviewed and terminated, property access had to be restricted, and security protocols required updating. The royal household's legal team worked throughout the day to ensure that all actions were properly documented and legally defensible, should any affected parties choose to challenge the decisions in court. By midday, the stress of the situation had begun to manifest in Camilla's physical appearance and behavior. Palace staff noticed that she seemed unsteady on her feet and had difficulty concentrating during routine meetings. Her lady-in-waiting expressed private concerns about the queen consort's well-being, noting that she had eaten very little since the crisis began and appeared to be experiencing symptoms of acute stress. The afternoon brought additional challenges as news of unusual activity at Windsor Castle began to circulate among royal reporters and photographers positioned outside the gates. The increased security presence and the cancellation of several scheduled engagements had not gone unnoticed, leading to speculation about potential health issues or family problems. The press office worked diligently to deflect inquiries without revealing the true nature of the crisis, but the sustained interest suggested that a major announcement would be expected soon. Charles made the decision to accelerate the timeline for the public statement, recognizing that delaying further would only increase speculation and potentially allow damaging information to leak through unofficial channels. The announcement was scheduled for the following morning, giving the affected family members less than 24 hours to prepare for the inevitable media attention and public scrutiny that would follow. The final draft of the statement underwent multiple revisions as Charles and his advisors attempted to strike the perfect balance between transparency and discretion. Every sentence was analyzed for potential misinterpretation, and several phrases were modified to avoid language that might be seen as unnecessarily harsh or vindictive. The document would be released simultaneously to all major media outlets to ensure fair coverage and prevent any single publication from gaining an exclusive advantage. As evening approached, the couple attempted to maintain some semblance of their normal routine, though the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. Dinner was served in their private dining room, but conversation was stilted and uncomfortable, with both Charles and Camilla lost in their own thoughts about the irreversible changes that would take effect within hours. The servants moved quietly around them, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding its full implications. The final hours before the announcement were spent in separate preparation, with Charles reviewing his talking points for potential media interviews, and Camilla composing personal messages to close friends who might be affected by the news. The isolation they felt from each other was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire crisis, as the very relationship that had sustained them through previous challenges now seemed strained by the weight of royal duty and personal obligation. Palace security was increased throughout the night, as officials anticipated a significant media response to the morning's announcement. Additional staff were brought in to handle the expected surge in telephone calls and correspondence, while communication specialists prepared responses to likely questions and criticisms. The machinery of modern monarchy moved into crisis management mode, though the human cost of the situation remained painfully apparent to everyone involved. As Charles lay in bed that final night before the announcement, he reflected on the irony that his efforts to protect the monarchy might ultimately damage the personal relationship that had brought him the greatest happiness in his later years. The crown demanded sacrifices, as he had learned throughout his long life. But this particular sacrifice felt especially cruel in its timing and scope. The morning of the announcement dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over the royal household. At precisely 9 o'clock, the official statement was released to all major news outlets simultaneously, sending shockwaves through the British media and immediately becoming the leading story across television, radio, and digital platforms. The carefully crafted words spoke of the need for all individuals associated with the royal family to uphold the highest standards of conduct, announcing the severance of ties with certain extended family members due to behavior incompatible with royal values. The immediate response was explosive, with royal correspondents scrambling to provide context and analysis while attempting to identify the specific family members referenced in the statement. Within minutes, the gates of Windsor Castle were surrounded by photographers and television crews, their telephoto lenses trained on every window and doorway in hopes of capturing images of the principal figures in this unfolding drama. The palace press office was inundated with requests for additional information, interviews, and clarification of the scope and permanence of the announced actions. Inside the castle, Camilla sat in her private sitting room, watching the news coverage with a mixture of fascination and horror. Seeing her personal family crisis dissected by strangers on national television was surreal and deeply unsettling. The commentators speculated about everything from financial scandals to personal vendettas, most of their theories missing the mark, but some coming uncomfortably close to the truth. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup, the familiar ritual providing little comfort in the face of such overwhelming public scrutiny. The Queen Consort had requested that her scheduled engagements for the day be cancelled, citing the need to be available for family consultations regarding the morning's announcement. In reality, she felt emotionally and physically unprepared to face public appearances while processing the magnitude of what had occurred. Her private secretary had readily agreed to the cancellations, having observed her declining condition over the previous 48 hours and recognizing the wisdom of avoiding potentially difficult situations with the media or public. Charles, meanwhile, maintained his scheduled appointments, believing that projecting normalcy and confidence would help stabilize public perception of the monarchy during this turbulent period. His first engagement was a meeting with business leaders about economic development initiatives, but the gathering was overshadowed by the morning's news. Every participant in the meeting was clearly preoccupied with the royal announcement, though protocol prevented anyone from directly addressing the subject during the formal proceedings. The king's demeanor during public appearances was carefully controlled, showing no visible signs of the emotional turmoil he was experiencing privately. Years of royal training had prepared him for maintaining composure under pressure, but the personal nature of this crisis made it particularly challenging to separate his public duties from his private anguish. His staff noted the extra effort required to maintain his usual level of engagement and charm during interactions with the public and officials. By midday, the story had evolved as investigative journalists began piecing together information about the specific allegations that had led to the royal family's dramatic action. While the palace had released minimal details, sources close to the situation began providing background information that painted a more complete picture of the financial irregularities, inappropriate associations, and public behavior that had prompted the severance of ties. The revelations were more serious than many had initially assumed, lending credibility to the royal family's decisive response. Camilla's condition began to deteriorate noticeably during the afternoon, as the stress of the situation and the lack of proper rest and nutrition over the previous days took their toll. Her lady-in-waiting became increasingly concerned about her pale complexion, unsteady movements, and apparent difficulty concentrating on routine tasks. Several times during the afternoon, staff members observed the Queen Consort appearing confused or disoriented, behaviors that were highly unusual for someone known for her sharp wit and clear thinking. The palace medical team was quietly consulted about Camilla's condition, though the decision was made to avoid any formal medical intervention that might create additional media attention. The royal physicians recommended rest, proper nutrition, and minimal stress, advice that seemed impossible to follow given the ongoing crisis and its demands on the Queen Consort's time and emotional energy. The medical professionals expressed particular concern about the potential for more serious health complications if the situation continued without some form of resolution or relief. As evening approached, the media coverage showed no signs of diminishing, with news programs devoting entire segments to analysis of the royal announcement and its implications for the monarchy. Royal biographers and constitutional experts were invited to provide commentary, offering varying perspectives on the precedent being set and the wisdom of such a public action. Some praised the king's decisive leadership and commitment to royal standards, while others questioned whether such personal matters should be handled so publicly. The affected family members began to emerge from their initial shock and started making their own statements to the media, some accepting the royal family's decision with dignity, while others expressed bitter disappointment and accused the palace of treating them unfairly. These contradictory responses created additional complications for the royal household's media management efforts, as they had little control over what Camilla's relatives might say to journalists eager for exclusive interviews and personal perspectives on the crisis. Camilla spent the evening attempting to call various family members to provide comfort and support, despite her own fragile emotional state. These conversations were often difficult and emotionally draining, as she found herself in the impossible position of defending her husband's decision while acknowledging her own pain at the loss of these important relationships. Her voice became increasingly strained with each call, and staff members noticed that she seemed to have difficulty maintaining her usual articulate communication style. The dinner hour brought no respite from the tension, as both Charles and Camilla struggled to maintain any semblance of normal conversation while the crisis continued to unfold around them. The dining room, usually a place of relaxation and intimate discussion, felt formal and uncomfortable as they navigated the complex emotions surrounding their situation. Charles made several attempts to reassure his wife that their marriage remained strong despite the challenges they were facing, but Camilla seemed to have difficulty processing these reassurances. The international media had picked up the story by evening, with royal correspondents from around the Commonwealth reporting on the unprecedented nature of the king's action and its potential impact on the monarchy's reputation globally. The story was being framed in various ways depending on the political perspectives of different news outlets, some viewing it as necessary modernization of royal standards while others saw it as evidence of dysfunction within the House of Windsor. Palace security reported increased activity outside all royal residences, as photographers and journalists attempted to capture images or statements from any members of the royal family. Additional protection measures were implemented to ensure the safety and privacy of the king and queen consort during this period of intense public interest. The security team also began monitoring social media platforms and online forums for potential threats or concerning reactions to the day's announcements. As the first day of the public crisis drew to a close, it became clear that the situation would not resolve quickly or quietly. The media attention showed no signs of diminishing, and the affected family members seemed prepared to fight for their reputations and relationships with the royal family. Charles and Camilla faced the prospect of days or even weeks of continued scrutiny while they attempted to navigate the personal and institutional challenges created by the severing of family ties. The evening concluded with both Charles and Camilla retiring earlier than usual, though neither expected to achieve restful sleep given the circumstances. The weight of public attention and personal anguish had created a perfect storm of stress that would test not only their individual resilience, but also the strength of their marriage and their commitment to the duties and sacrifices required by their unique positions in British society. The third day of the crisis brought an unexpected and alarming development that would transform the entire narrative surrounding the royal family's decision. Camilla had awakened feeling dizzy and disoriented, symptoms that her lady-in-waiting initially attributed to the ongoing stress and lack of proper sleep. However, as the morning progressed, her condition deteriorated rapidly, causing genuine concern among the palace staff who had never seen the usually resilient queen consort in such a vulnerable state. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, while attempting to review correspondence in her private study, Camilla suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of nausea and weakness. The room seemed to spin around her as she gripped the edge of her mahogany desk, fighting to maintain her balance and composure. Her vision blurred momentarily, and she experienced a frightening sensation of detachment from her surroundings, as if she were observing the scene from outside her own body. Her lady-in-waiting, who had been quietly organizing appointments in the adjacent room, heard the sound of papers falling and rushed to investigate. She found Camilla slumped in her chair, pale and struggling to maintain consciousness, her breathing shallow and rapid. The sight of the normally composed queen consort in such distress immediately triggered the palace's medical emergency protocols, with staff members trained in first aid rushing to assess the situation while others alerted the royal medical team. The palace doctor arrived within minutes, having been on standby due to previous concerns about Camilla's condition during the ongoing family crisis. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had served the royal household for over a decade, quickly assessed the queen consort's vital signs and determined that immediate medical intervention was necessary. Camilla's blood pressure had dropped significantly, and her pulse was irregular, symptoms that suggested a serious stress-related medical episode requiring urgent attention. Charles was immediately summoned from his morning meetings, his usual composed demeanor cracking as he rushed to his wife's side. The sight of Camilla, normally so strong and resilient, appearing fragile and vulnerable in the ornate chair of her study, brought home the true cost of the decision he had made. The irony was not lost on him that his efforts to protect the monarchy had potentially endangered the person he loved most in the world. The decision was made to transport Camilla to the private wing of King Edward VII Hospital in London, where she could receive specialized care away from the prying eyes of the media and public. The logistics of this transfer were complex, requiring careful coordination between the palace, the hospital, and security services to ensure both the queen consort's safety and the confidentiality of her medical condition. An elaborate diversionary operation was put in place to mislead journalists and photographers about her whereabouts. As the royal motorcade made its way through the streets of London, with Camilla lying semi-conscious in the back of the specially equipped medical vehicle, Charles found himself confronting the possibility that his actions had contributed to a medical emergency that could have serious long-term consequences. The weight of responsibility he felt was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that the crisis was far from over and that Camilla's collapse would only intensify public scrutiny of their situation. The hospital's medical team, led by Dr. James Harrison, one of Britain's most respected cardiologists, conducted a comprehensive examination that revealed the full extent of Camilla's condition. The stress of the family crisis had triggered a significant cardiovascular episode, combined with severe dehydration and exhaustion from days of inadequate rest and nutrition. While not immediately life-threatening, her condition required careful monitoring and treatment to prevent more serious complications. News of the Queen Consort's hospitalization could not be contained for long, despite the palace's efforts to maintain privacy. Within hours of her admission, reports began to surface suggesting that a senior member of the royal family had been taken to hospital, though initial reports were vague about the identity of the patient and the nature of their condition. The speculation intensified when eagle-eyed photographers noticed increased security around King Edward VII Hospital and the presence of vehicles from the royal fleet. The palace found itself in an impossible position, needing to balance transparency with privacy while managing a medical emergency that had political and constitutional implications. If Camilla's condition were serious, protocols existed for handling the incapacitation of senior royals, but her role as queen consort created unique considerations that had rarely been tested in modern times. Constitutional experts were quietly consulted about the implications of her inability to fulfill official duties. Charles maintained a constant vigil at his wife's bedside, leaving the hospital only for the most essential royal duties and returning immediately afterward. His haggard appearance during these brief public appearances did not go unnoticed by royal watchers, who began to piece together the connection between the family crisis, the queen consort's sudden absence from public life, and the king's obviously distressed state. The human drama behind the royal announcement became increasingly apparent to those observing the situation closely. The medical team's prognosis was cautiously optimistic, but they emphasized that Camilla's recovery would require an extended period of rest and reduced stress, conditions that seemed impossible to achieve while the family crisis remained unresolved and the media attention continued unabated. Dr. Harrison privately advised Charles that his wife's condition could deteriorate again if she were forced to return to normal duties too quickly or if additional stressors were introduced. The irony of the situation became increasingly apparent as days passed in the hospital. The very action Charles had taken to protect the monarchy had created a new crisis that threatened to overshadow the original family scandal. Media coverage shifted from analyzing the severance of ties with Camilla's family to speculating about the queen consort's health and the stability of the royal marriage. Public sympathy began to swing toward Camilla as details of her hospitalization became known, with many viewing her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control rather than a participant in the family scandal that had triggered the crisis. Letters and flowers began arriving at the hospital from well-wishers across Britain and the Commonwealth, creating a groundswell of support that complicated the narrative the palace had been trying to manage. The affected family members, initially focused on their own grievances against the royal family's decision, found themselves in the awkward position of having to respond to questions about Camilla's condition and their role in creating the stress that had led to her collapse. Some expressed genuine remorse and concern for her well-being, while others maintained their defensive positions, creating a complex web of competing narratives that the media eagerly explored. Charles began to question whether the cost of his decision had been too high, not just in personal terms, but also in its impact on the monarchy's reputation and stability. The sight of his wife in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment and fighting to recover from stress-related illness, forced him to confront the possibility that his choice between duty and family loyalty had been fundamentally flawed. The crown's demands had never seemed more ruthless or unforgiving. As Camilla slowly began to recover, showing signs of improved stability and awareness, the conversations between husband and wife took on a new depth and honesty. The artificial barriers created by royal protocol seemed less important in the sterile environment of the hospital room, where their shared vulnerability allowed for discussions that might not have been possible within the formal confines of palace life. They spoke openly about their fears, regrets, and hopes for rebuilding their relationship and moving forward together. The medical crisis had inadvertently created an opportunity for reflection and reassessment that might not have occurred otherwise. Charles began to explore options for modifying his approach to the family situation, seeking ways to uphold royal standards while acknowledging the human cost of his actions. Legal advisors were consulted about possible compromises that might allow for some form of reconciliation without compromising the monarchy's principles. The hospital room, with its view of London's skyline and the distant spires of Westminster, became an unlikely sanctuary where Charles and Camilla could begin the process of healing both her physical condition and their damaged relationship. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their marriage might ultimately strengthen it, if they could find a way to navigate the complex demands of royal duty while preserving their human connection and love for each other.